which is about democracy in American politics. And I've divided it into three separate lectures. And the first one is going to be unpacking key ideas of democracy. Just as a warning, this goes a little bit fast just because this is an issue that has been discussed for millennium. And so it's not something that we can do fully, but to give some sense of the underlying ideas that exist around the ideas of democracy. Um, and so what I will do is to highlight some of the main things from the textbook, but then also expand on some of those and talk about how those work out in practice. So when we take a look at the idea of democracy, one place to start is actually the title of your textbook. The textbook is called The Struggle for Democracy. And so what we want to know is, in what ways can democracy be a struggle? Many people think of democracy as a very positive thing, and so they don't necessarily think about the struggles that are part of the idea of democracy. And one thing about that is, as I have on the second slide here, is this idea that a democracy is dynamic and not static. And sometimes it's easy to fall into this viewpoint that democracy is a good thing and non-democracies are a bad thing. And so what I suggest is that that viewpoint is one of thinking of it sort of as a dichotomy. It is either you have a democracy, one, or you don't have a democracy, zero. Or yes, you have a democracy, no, you don't. That's a dichotomy where there are two separate categories. But the better way to think of this is to think of it as a continuum between 0 and 100. Now, the exact numbers you can give to these things are things that political scientists and other social scientists can debate about how specific can you give those numbers. But the idea of a continuum is one that at least points out that there are ways in which these complex things that contribute to the idea of democracy can lead to a different set of numbers. And we'll come back to this idea of a continuum when we talk about some other things like ideology and some other aspects of kind of the political world that people find useful, is to move beyond simply two categories and think of it as a much more complex one. The other thing to think about is that democracy is imperfect. And I have a couple of quotations that suggest that. Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, said that it is the worst form of government besides all others. He was saying that from personal experiences. For some of you might have seen the movies recently talking about the life of Winston Churchill and the role that he played, particularly during World War II. He was seen as a hero. He was seen as the one at Britain do their successful protection of their island. And so was somewhat surprised that once he became a peacetime prime minister, he was removed by his political party, thinking that someone else would be more appropriate during peacetime. And so it's a suggestion, certainly from his point of view, that there are some problems with the idea of democracy, that he could be removed from office even though he was really successful. But the other part of it is the observation that it is one that even though there are problems with it, it is still something that you can rank better than other forms of rule. H.L. Mencken, who is an observer of American politics, argued that democracy is a theory that the people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. The idea behind that is that democracy is one that certainly puts an emphasis on we the people, as we'll be talking about, the role of the people, rule by the people. But at the same time, it is one that is a bit problematic because what if people don't know what they want? What if people are easily swayed by someone else telling them how they should vote, how they should act? If people are made afraid, as we'll be talking about later in the course, particularly when we talk about civil liberties, there was a concern by the framers of the US Constitution, in this case Benjamin Franklin, who thought that individuals would be easily persuaded to vote for protecting themselves, even if it meant giving up these essential liberties, these essential freedoms that they think are so important. And we'll be talking about that when we talk about the ideas of civil liberties. The other idea about a struggle is that it demands citizen participation and vigilance. It is one that democracy needs us to be continually part of. Many people believe, particularly in a representative democracy like we have in our system, and we'll talk about why we have that and why that is a little bit later, But the idea behind saying that it requires citizen participation and vigilance, certainly you need to participate when there are elections, is the idea that for there to be ruled by the people must have their voices heard. But at the same time, there is a recognition that voting's not enough. Elections are very important, but they're not enough to create a democracy. You need to have some other aspects of it. One way of saying it in social science is that elections are considered to be necessary but not sufficient. When you say that they're necessary, you make it the point that it is very hard to say that a system that does not have any elections is in fact democracy. But at the same time, the elections themselves are not sufficient to say that there is a democracy. There was some debate about this in terms of what happened during the Iraq War, in that some believed that the Bush administration was taking credit for making the world safe for democracy, as Woodrow Wilson said, but in successfully toppling Saddam Hussein and saying that now we have democracy. But it took a lot more than just toppling the dictator and then also instilling elections in Iraq, that even if the outcomes of those elections need to be taken into account. Another way of thinking about this is that your textbook calls democracy an aspiration, the idea that it is a hope. It's not one that is meant to be a utopia. It is not something that is simply something on a pedestal that we can't actually touch. It is meant to be lived, but at the same time, part of democracy is the idea that there is an aspirational aspect to it. There is some hope that democracy will have an influence on us. It is not simply something about what role we play, but that in participating in the political process, it may change us. It may have us think about things in a different way. We might actually change our opinions because we hear what other people say about those things. And so the idea of democracy as an aspiration is one that's pointing out that it is meant to be a combination of this kind of dynamism, but also a requirement of citizen participation and vigilance. But there's also another important thing to recognize, is that at the same time, democracies can be wrong. There's often a viewpoint that if you think of democracies as a positive thing, then you would necessarily suggest that democracies are always right. Just because a majority wants something doesn't make it a good thing. There are examples that from the United States history that suggest that in the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II was an indication that clearly democracy can be wrong, because the policies, although put forward by government officials, were supported by a majority of Americans. As we'll be talking about when we talk about civil liberties, a majority of Americans also want some things, for example, prayer in public school, or they might want something along the lines of restricting certain individual liberties to make themselves feel safer. And I'm not saying that a position saying that there is prayer in public school is necessarily wrong, but the people who make those might not be thinking about all the different individuals in terms of the types of religious identity people might have, including no religion at all. And so simply because a majority says something and because you have a system of majority rule doesn't mean that they're absolutely correct in doing so. And so given all of this, the idea of the struggle for democracy, it's part of the reason I chose this textbook. It's meant to be a theme throughout the course. The textbook brings this up a number of times, and there are going to be assignments and exam questions that point out this struggle. You will also be demonstrating this struggle throughout in terms of the discussion board postings that you do for each class, but then also for the essays that you write. You want to think about this in terms of saying that demonstrating the ways in which things are complicated, the ways in which people might disagree with you. Thinking about writing an essay, it's always useful to think about how critics might disagree with you and anticipate what their concerns are. So moving on to the next slide, we want to unpack the idea of democracy a little bit. Starting with the definition of democracy, before we unpack it, let's talk about what it is. And the definition of democracy that you can get from the dictionary is the idea of rule by the people. And that seems to make sense. It's an important observation. It makes it distinct from other forms of government where you would have, for example, you can have rule by the people, but you might have a monarchy, a rule by one individual, usually a king or a queen. You could have an oligarchy, which is ruled by many people, usually some sort of elites, economic elites, social elites, and things like that. You can have a theocracy, which is ruled by religious leaders. And so talking about rule by the people, saying you have a democracy, does put you in a different category than some of the other forms of rule. But there's still questions that remain when you say that you have a system of democracy where there is rule by the people, and they have a few questions, and we're going to spend the rest of the time in this section talking about that. And the first one is that who should be allowed to make the decisions? And when you say the people, you want to think about more carefully exactly what people. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide. We're going to break that open a little bit, and we're going to do it in more obvious ways, and then perhaps in ways people might not have considered, because there are recent attempts by particularly Republicans, Republican legislatures and governors, to demand that you have photo ID when you go and vote. And so we want to think about that in terms of that, because some people may have access to the photo ID, a driver's license, or a state-issued ID, whereas other people might not. And so even if the people who are advocating for this aren't really thinking about the issue, they may be restricting who the people are who can actually influence the outcomes if they're not allowed to vote if they don't have photo ID. The other question is the idea of, do the people get to vote on every issue? So you can think about complicated things in terms of international affairs. What about topics that require top secret information? Should we launch strikes on Iran if it doesn't abide by the restriction on nuclear material? That's something that's sort of ripped from the headlines right now. And so it is something we have to think about, of whether or not we should be able to make a decision on that, because in order to make an informed decision, we have to know about the top secret information that decides whether or not it is a good thing or a bad thing, or exactly what sort of response is appropriate. But then there are also ones that may not require top secret information, but might require some sort of expertise. Should large banks be able to invest in risky investment schemes, even if the losses could destroy the bank? Ideas about agriculture and agricultural reform. I'm not an expert on those things, but those are things that matter significantly for different parts of the country, even parts of California, certainly for the entire country. And so if expertise is required to make those decisions, how do we get that expertise? And if we don't have that expertise, should we be allowed to weigh in on these things? And then finally, there's this larger question in terms of, should we have the faith in ourselves and other people to make informed decisions in a complicated society with complicated issues? And this is one that is previewing some of the ideas that the framers of the US Constitution had. And for them, they argue that in many ways we don't and shouldn't have that sort of faith in ourselves and other people, and that we needed to set up a system that had rule by the people, certainly, but at the same time recognizing the weaknesses of the people, that we don't necessarily have the level of information that we need to have, we don't seek it out, that we don't make the decisions based on that information all the time. And so some people are arguing that one of the good things of democracy is that it puts the faith in everyday human beings to make decisions. If you think about the system of a monarchy, it was this idea that God has chosen the king and let the king decide, because the God divinely has chosen that individual make decisions. If you have something like a theocracy, it could be something similar. If you talk about an oligarchy, it is that those individuals, because they're successful, economically and socially successful, they have the right and the insights into making decisions to move forward. The idea of democracy is saying that the faith that we're putting is in the people, and so that can be a positive thing. But at the same time, there are questions about whether or not we should have that level of faith in ourselves and in our others. Are we really going to do that in ways that we want to and should? So now moving on to the next slide, we want to think about a question in terms of, as we talked about, one of the questions when you have democracy is who should be allowed to vote? And so the first one is age restrictions. In the United States, you must be 18 to be eligible to vote, 18 or older. It used to be 21. It was changed by the 26th Amendment in 1971 to be 18 years of age. Some countries, for example, one of the areas that I study is the United Kingdom, and Scotland in its 2014 referendum to ask whether Scotland become independent from the United Kingdom, lowered the voting age to 16. They made the argument that on some level that should be done, because if you're talking about a mass change to society, the younger folks are going to be the ones who bear the brunt of that for the longest period of time, so we should hear their ideas. Others pointed out that it might have been a more political move on their part, because those individuals who are more likely to support independence were those who were 16 and 17-year-olds. And so there is some concern that there was one reason that was given, the other reason was a very different one. So that is certainly one where people want to say, okay, what age are people allowed to vote? Another one is the idea of sex. Women were not allowed to vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and we'll be talking about that later in the course. But certainly there were ways that historically, and even to this day, there are places in the Middle East and other places where women are significantly restricted from having their ideas heard in the larger society and in terms of politics. Certainly in the history of the United States, the idea of race, African American men were not allowed to vote until 1870 with the 15th Amendment. And even with the passage of that and the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution, there were still, as we'll be talking about when we talk about civil rights, there were, in addition to legal restrictions, there were de facto, on the ground restrictions that were often placed. There were literacy tests. In order to vote, you would have to prove that you were a literate individual. And as what we talk about with civil rights, that was written in such a way as to make it that certain people pass those tests, white people, and then certain people could not. Those would be African Americans. And even then, there was a recognition that some poorer whites wouldn't be able to pass a test, so they would add in saying that there was a grandfather clause, that those individuals whose grandfathers were not slaves could vote even without passing the literacy test. Other restrictions that were placed on it were poll taxes, threats of violence if people decided that they were African Americans and they wanted to actually vote. The threats of violence in terms of asking for that right was a way to intimidate people. And all of those limited the rights of African Americans to vote until the 1960s. There are other restrictions. There's debate going on in terms of whether felons should be allowed to vote. In some ways, it would make sense that those who transgress the laws of society, break certain laws, and are placed into prison, that maybe they shouldn't be allowed to vote. And then the question is at what point, when a prisoner is released from prison, when and how do they get the right to vote? So there's a variation. As we have in the slides, Maine and Vermont all allow felons to have the right to vote even when they're in prison. So there are 2 states in the Union where even if you are a felon, they have thought about this and said, no, you still have your right to vote. Many states have it that you can't vote when you're in prison, but the voting rights are restored once you're released. California tends to be in that category. It's a little more complicated, but generally speaking, we could put California basically in that middle category where you're not allowed to vote when you're in prison, but the voting rights are restored once you're released. The release from prison is what triggers getting your voting rights back. But some states, many of them in the South, is that you're certainly not allowed to vote while you're in prison, but it is also the case that your voting rights are not restored automatically upon release. Instead, it requires former inmates to appeal to the government to ask for their voting rights, and that is a difficult thing to do. Sometimes the commissions that are responsible for deciding whether or not your voting rights should be given back are made up of high-powered officials. The governor of the state of Florida, for example, was on a board to decide these things. It's expensive, it's time-consuming. You have to put yourself in front of the board and say that you're a changed person and revisit the things that got you to prison in the first place. And then you also have the politicians themselves are often reticent to be soft on crime. It is often something that is a pretty easy political attack to say that someone is soft on crime and therefore you shouldn't vote for that person. And so if the individuals who are there are in some ways running for re-election, they might be unlikely to allow individuals to have their voting rights back. And so what I've put together and would ask you to take a look at is a video that talks about the historical overview of voting rights in the United States, with a particular emphasis in terms of what direction things have gone in terms of from the founding till now. Have we generally increased the number of people who can vote, or has it changed over time? And as the video points out, it is a general positive movement forward. There is certainly some concern that, as we talked about just a little bit ago, that the 15th Amendment allowed African American men the right to vote, but then there were other restrictions placed on that. But generally speaking, the movement has been in the United States in a larger historical trend to increase the size of the population that can participate in voting. So moving on to the next slide in this group is this idea of photo ID laws. And so, as that suggests, recently there's a debate about whether the government should ask an individual to prove your identity before you're allowed to vote. And so, for some people, that makes a lot of sense because, uh, back in the day, a few years ago, it isn't as much now because of the card readers that they have with paying for groceries in a supermarket or something like that. But a few years ago, you may remember this, you may not, but I can tell you this, is that when you would pay with credit card, you would be asked to show your photo ID, make sure that you are the person who's listed on the credit card. And so one argument is to say that voting is certainly as important as buying a pack of gum in a grocery store. And so therefore, why shouldn't we ask people to identify themselves and say, yes, this is me, I'm coming in to vote. And therefore, you should have a photo ID to make sure that you are the person who you say you are. Other is this idea, as we've been talking about, there's a very positive view about democracy, and those in favor of saying that you need to have photo ID in order to have the right to vote in the actual voting booth is saying that you're protecting against voter fraud, to make sure that individuals aren't pretending to be someone else, voting multiple times, going in different places and voting where they don't even live because they want to make sure a particular political candidate wins or loses. The other is that they are worried about protecting the security of the electoral process. And because we have this idea of democracy as an aspiration, because democracy is such an important thing, we often can think about the idea that we would want to protect that as much as possible. But those who are opposed to photo ID laws suggest that there is absolutely no evidence of fraud. Just because you could think of a possibility that there would be a lot of electoral fraud doesn't mean that there is. And requiring photo ID, more importantly, impacts certain groups unfairly. So some people have those photo IDs and other people don't. And therefore, as we're going to be talking about a little bit later in this chapter, is this idea that that would have an impact in terms of political equality, that some people would be treated differently than others because you have a photo ID requirement. And so it's easy to dismiss and say, oh, well, if the photo ID is a driver's license, everyone drives. But there are a lot of people who don't drive, that they take public transportation to get to work, they can't afford the car insurance, they can't afford